in the 18th century. In 1791, there were roughly 11,680 African Methodists, and their numbers increased until they accounted for almost a fourth of the total church membership by 1797. 1791, there were roughly 11,680 African Methodists, and those numbers increased. By 1861, the Methodist Church contained roughly 210,000 Africans. And this information is documented in 2 different books if you have opportunity. Oh, by the way, hopefully you picked up this document, Lessons of the African-American Presence. I think we still have some more of those. And in that, on the back, I've added a reading list. Most of this information comes out of these 2 books. You can see this one is worn. It's called Black United Methodist Retrospect and Prospect by J.H. Graham, and the other one is The Black People in the United Methodist Church, Whither Thou Goest by William B. Bobby McLean. These are 2 great books that help us understand the presence of the African-American presence, the black presence in the church. So that's a part of your reading list. Africans preferred separate services because they could worship away from the watchful eye of slave masters, slaveholders. They enjoyed the freedom in speaking, singing, shouting, and praying they could not enjoy in the presence of their masters. I said some African blacks worked in the house, and some worked in the field. And because of that, people saw that as a distinction. I said, now keep in mind, those who worked in the house, unbeknownst to their masters, aided those that worked in the field. I said, my mother wouldn't allow me to work in the field. That's, I was the youngest child, so I learned a lot of skills working in the house. However, I did, once I got married and I couldn't get housework, I had to work in the field. I had to dig ditches and things like that. I said, so that point of distinction has been something that we kid one another about back and forth, whether you are a house Negro or a field Negro. And I said, you know, that distinction goes back and forth. So that's an interesting dynamic because people thought that there was a separation in them. They enjoyed the freedom of speaking, singing, shouting, and praying that they could not enjoy in the presence of their masters. Even when segregation, whether it was forced or volunteer, took place, it is possible that the Methodist Church approach to salvation through a marked and often traumatic conversion experience served as an equalizer. Whether you were in a forced segregation or volunteer segregation, it is possible that the Methodist approach to salvation through a marked and often traumatic conversion experience served as an equalizer because the rich and the free had no greater access to heaven than the poor and the enslaved. Because of this traumatic conversion experience, it became an equalizer. It didn't matter whether you were rich and free or whether you were poor and marginalized. It did not give either side great advantage to enter the kingdom. Methodism could be used by both free and enslaved Africans to make sense of the world and help create a more humane way of life. So we begin to see, keep in mind, we are in the late 1700s. And this movement is providing people, regardless of their station or status in life, the opportunity to enter into God's grace and to be a part of God's kingdom building. Because they, at that point, realize that there comes this moment in our life that it doesn't matter whether we're rich and free or enslaved and poor. At some point, we all will end up in the same place. So we need to find a way to improve our existence here on this earth. Methodism provided an intellectual and ritual link between the two worlds known by the enslaved Africans. The emphasis on the spiritual deliverance was appealing and beneficial because of the implications of physical freedom. W. Du Bois expands upon this concept of this two worlds that Africans live in, or Negroes today, blacks live in, he called it a double consciousness, that at one time we were one at the same time American, then we were one at the same time Negro. There's this dimension that goes on that we have to walk in two worlds, and people have to be aware of that. The emphasis on spiritual living was appealing and beneficial because of its implications for physical freedom. Some Methodist ministers, including Africans who had greater access to pulpits in Methodist meetings, made an effort in their sermons to speak to the sufferings endured by Africans. Some preachers spoke to this condition of one being enslaved and one not being enslaved. When we get to Charles A. Tinley, who has written a lot of hymns, there is a part of our experience that we would talk about, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, we're going to put on our shoes and shout out all God's heaven. So no matter what the condition or status that you were living on the earth, when we get to the other side, equality will reign supreme. Some would call that compensatory theology. We might be denied, what our unalienable rights are here on earth, but when we get to heaven, we will see God as he really is. I think Paul talks about that, though we look through a glass dimly, but then we will see him face to face. Francis Asbury believed the work of Methodists should destroy the system of slavery. Francis Asbury believed that the work of Methodists should destroy the system of slavery by restricting membership to those who did not hold slaves. In other words, he felt, keep in mind this is late 1700s, the beginning of the 19th century. Keep that in mind, lock that in your mind that early on, Francis Asbury believed that the Methodist story could destroy the system of slavery by saying that only those who do not own slaves could be Methodists. Just want you to put that in your pipe and smoke it. Perceived as threatening to the economic welfare planners, these efforts by Methodist ministers were met with wide resistance. Can you imagine that? That doesn't seem real, does it? Assumed connections between Methodist teachings and slave revolts fueled this resistance. Many within the Methodist Episcopal Church made peace with the slave trade system because in the long run, the mission of the church was to preach the gospel to every creature, Negro as well as white. This position early on that Asbury had became a threat to the economic welfare planners. So then, the connection between Methodism and teaching and slave revolts fueled resistance so that the Methodist ME Church made peace with the slave system because in the long run, the mission was to preach the gospel, not set people free, just preach the gospel. Thus, the notion of common redemption or spiritual freedom for all did not mean freedom on earth. Methodist preachers reconciled their concern for enslaved Africans with demands of slave holders by emphasizing the saving of souls, irrespective of the physical body's fate. So there was this dichotomy created that we're here to save your soul, but not to end your enslavement. It's a separation, a dichotomy. We're here to save your soul so that you won't go to hell, but when you leave here, you'll go to earth. But when you leave here, you'll go to heaven. But while you're here, you're still going to be a slave. Interesting. There we go. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is also known as the AME Church or the AMEC Church. You'll see it listed some ways as an acronym, AME or AMEC, which basically stands for African Methodist Episcopal Church, also known as the Freedom Church. The development of the African Methodist Episcopal Church draws together both the experiences of freedom and slavery, which is demonstrated by the life of the founder of the denomination, Richard Allen. Allen was converted in 1777, and he was encouraged to enter the ministry. Allen purchased his freedom after conversion of his owner by working for hire off of the plantation. In other words, he was hired off of his plantation, or he found ways to be contracted to do work off of his plantation. Shortly after he secured his freedom, Francis Asbury and other Methodist ministers gave Allen preaching opportunities, including one at St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, where Asbury first preached in America. In 1787, Allen and several others developed the Free African Society as a mutual, In 1787, Allen and several others developed the Free African Society as a mutual aid society to address the full range of needs of African Americans which were not being addressed in regular church gatherings and social opportunities of Philadelphia. This benevolent organization helped provide moral guidance and financial assistance as part of the Christian life. It helped people that were in financial distress. It helped them acquire loans, small loans. It helped them in their burial plans. It helped them in getting their children's education. That's why it was known as a Free African Society, a mutual aid society. It assisted people when the church was unable to do that, because keep in mind, they are still under the wings of a particular church, and now we are beginning to witness how they're going to be segregated in that worship experience. The rapid growth in the numbers of African worshipers, keep in mind, see how the words are being used, African. The rapid growth in the number of African worshipers at St. George's Church propelled discussions of issues charged with implicit racism, such as where should Africans sit and how should they participate in the services. Where should they sit, and at what point do we allow them to participate in the services, the sacraments, and the ministries of the congregation? In 1787, when African members were physically removed from praying at the altar, they withdrew from the church, vowing never to return. As we said last week, there you have two schools of thought on this. Some would say that Allen and others were illiterate and they were told that they didn't understand what the sexton or the ushers were sharing with them. They thought that they misunderstood the directions. They were told to go in the balcony, and they thought that the altar was the balcony, so they went down. Other school of thought is that it was an intentional act, since they had accepted God's free grace. They believed in God's free grace. Francis Asbury had shared with them this notion that the way to deal with slavery is to continue to emphasize God's grace and to restrict membership to non-slave holders. So they felt that they had allies at St. George's Church who believed that it was now time for all of us to come together, because that's what the Bible talked about. So we have these two schools of thought. So it was a deliberate act on their part to go to the altar and participate fully in the worship services at St. George's Church. What started as a society to supplement the inadequate assistance received from whites became an African church. Debate within St. George's continued until 1816, when Legal Action, the Methodist Episcopal Church, sued when a white elder was denied the church's pulpit. This worked in the new church's favor, freeing it from control of ministers appointed by St. George Methodist Episcopal Church. Make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, good. Notice the question was last week when they separated. Did they exclude anyone? No, they did not exclude anyone. Their services were open, but they wanted to have their own preachers in their pulpit. They were still under the auspices of St. George, but St. George wanted to assign who would do the preaching, because of the notion that these societies may be fueling unrest, dissension, and revolt, and the rapid abolition or abolishment of slavery. There had to be some internal and external controls on them. So that was the debate that went on. So it became to the point that St. George's Church sued them, and the suit worked in the favor of the new church because it freed them from the control of ministers appointed by St. George's Methodist Church. Most of the society members who formed the African church held an interest in joining the Church of England. But Allen convinced them plain doctrine and good discipline were best attainable through Methodism. Beholden to Methodists was the phrase. He and others purchased an old blacksmith shop and turned it into a place of worship. In 1794, they were removed in 1787. They continued worshiping. In 1794, Francis Asbury dedicates this facility they have converted into a church as Bethel Church, and Allen was ordained by Asbury in 1799. Keep in mind, the Methodist movement in America became officially started during the Christmas conference of 1784, December 23, 24, and 25. Asbury is ordained a deacon, elder, and then a bishop. Richard Allen and Harry Hoosier are present, but 3 years later, the segregation occurs. They create their own society. Now, keep in mind, all African blacks did not leave with that group. Some of them remained with the St. George's group. So now Asbury and others, they dedicate the new facility, and then Allen is ordained in 1799 by Francis Asbury. As the church continued to grow and receive word from other societies in New Jersey, Maryland, and other surrounding areas, where African Methodists experienced similar hardships and sought ways of freeing themselves from religious and social constraints. It is rather interesting that many of these churches began to have, in their construction, the balconies were created for the Africans, or the exterior or the outside of the nave of the sanctuary. I think I got that correct. This is where the Africans would sit, or in the back. But as many others, because keep in mind, Methodism is having such a hold on Africans that they see it as the best option to come to know God and Jesus Christ. So the growth and the spread of it is so phenomenal, it's moving so fast and rapid, because keep in mind, we're dealing with what is called, I think, historically as the first great awakening in the American colonies. This is the first great awakening. So these are growing so fast, and but other churches are experiencing the same thing. Other people are experiencing, other groups are experiencing the same thing that happened at St. George. So these common issues and worries resulted in these various congregations uniting under the banner of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia on April 9, 1816. This became the first African-American denomination founded in the United States of America. Their leaving the Methodist Episcopal Church was not based on a doctrinal disagreement. They chose to use the Methodist Episcopal Church's Book of Discipline, but strengthen its anti-slavery stance. You need to keep that in mind. It was not a doctrinal difference, because they appreciated and affirmed what was being said. And they continued to use the Methodist Church's Book of Discipline, but they strengthened its anti-slavery stance. During the first General Conference of the AME Church in 1816, Daniel Coker was elected the first bishop. However, he was more interested in missionary activity in West Africa. Thus, Richard Allen was elected in his place and served in this capacity while pastoring Bethel Church in Philadelphia. Isn't that something? You're a bishop and you're pastoring a church at the same time. The Book of Common Concern, today known as the Sunday School Union, developed in 1818. It became the first publishing house in the United States created and owned by African Americans. In 1818, the first publishing house in the United States created and owned by African Americans was the Book Concern Department, or today known as the Sunday School Union. And it's interesting that for years, our publishing house, the United Methodist Publishing House, better known as Cokesbury African Press, and the AME's publishing house were on the same street in Nashville, Tennessee, and around the corner was the Southern Baptist Publishing House. Isn't that something? All this is in Nashville. I wonder what Nashville has going for it. Let's see. No. There we go. Daniel Payne did more to increase the educational emphasis of the AME Church. Daniel Payne. His efforts eventually resulted in the founding of the AME Church's Wilberforce University in Ohio in 1856. Question: Wilberforce University is named after who? William Wilberforce was who? And what did he and John Wesley have a discussion about? Isn't that something? At first, Wilberforce was for slavery, and John Wesley, in the letter we shared with you last week, shared with him and called it the inexorable villainy, the scandal of religion. And because of his change of position, he changed his position on slavery and put forth the bill which became the law, where the Commonwealth of England abolished slavery and the importation of slaves. And in that regard, the AME Church named their first university in America after him. That's interesting, isn't it? For many whites, this focus on education, combined with the claims of independence, marked the AME Church as a dangerous organization. Seems like I've heard that before, isn't it? Because they combine education with independence. They marked the AME Church as a dangerous organization. In addition, slave rebellions such as the one in which AME minister Morris Brown was implicated closed most plantations to evangelists, particularly evangelists from the North, whose very presence could spark ideas of freedom. Until the Civil War, AME ministers were more active outside the Deep South. Because they were focused on education and independence, they were marked as a terrorist organization. They were marked as a dangerous organization. Isn't that something? The development of the AME Church in the South was not strictly the result of AME efforts to advance the kingdom of God on earth. Many white congregations encouraged African members to leave and join the churches better suited for them. For many former slaves, joining the AME Church was an opportunity to exercise freedom and liberty long denied. Now keep in mind, this is what was being said in around 1820 to 1840. But at the same time, continuing the story, I discovered that there was a movement in the North Alabama Conference. That's where I'm going with the story. That superintendents, a particular superintendent, whose name I won't call, he's not related to none of y'all in here, but he was encouraging churches in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, why don't you all just leave and become AMEs? I'm telling you, this mindset was still going on. Why don't y'all leave and become AMEs? Why don't you because, in other words, they saw those of us who never left the Methodist Church, the Sons of Harry, as being some kind of drain on the resources. And when I heard of this, I couldn't believe it until he suggested it to me one day. And I said, I can't tell you what I really said, because we'll deal with that another point. But where I'm going with this whole story is that mindset existed, that we as Negroes, black, because at that point we were not African American, were not qualified to be in the United Methodist Church. And this is in late 1970s, 1980s. Okay. Many white congregations encouraged African members to leave and join churches better suited for them. Many former slaves joined the AME Church was an opportunity to exercise freedom and liberty long denied. Many freed men and women took their invisible religious institutions and placed over them a visible framework in the form of the AME Church. On that reading list is a book by Albert Raboteau called Slave Rebellion. It talks about the invisible institution, the black church. The black church, from slavery's coming into America, there always was a religious community, but it was known as the invisible institution because it had to be away from the slave master. So what's happening now is what was invisible out up under the trees now becomes visible in the framework of the AME Church. The AME Church understood itself as elected by God to bring salvation and to uplift the unfortunate members of its race. That's the AME Church. Now we're going to deal with the AME Zion Church. Yeah. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AME Zion. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AME Zion, or AME, has its roots, keep in mind, the AME Church comes out of St. George in Philadelphia. The AME Zion Church has its roots coming out of John Street Church in New York City. One has its roots coming out of Philadelphia. The other one has its roots coming out of John Street Church in New York City. As the size of the congregation at John Street Church increased, proper accommodations for white members made the presence of Africans problematic. Both St. George's Church in Philadelphia and John Street Church decided on the same solution. Because what was happening is that African slaves were being drawn to this message. So they began to see themselves as being a part of something that was radically different than what was going on outside the church. So Methodism, and keep in mind, John Wesley is still writing letters to these churches, expressing, basically defining what Methodism is. He's still writing letters. So they saw this opportunity, so people were being drawn into these churches till it got to the point that Africans were outnumbering Europeans or Anglo-Americans in these congregations. Both St. John's Church and John Street Church decided on the same solution: segregated seating and restricted access to important rituals and rites. Segregated seating and restricted access to important rites and rituals. Peter Williams and others representing the African membership petitioned Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury was the bishop. Keep in mind, he was the one that dedicated Bethel Church in Philadelphia. Now he's dealing with a similar situation with John Street Church in New York City. They petitioned Francis Asbury to hold regular meetings on their own beginning in 1796. See, because he has allowed this in 1794 to create Bethel Church. He ordains Richard Allen in 17. So they're saying, well, you did it for them, why not do the same thing for us? The request was approved, and 4 years later, Zion Church was built and incorporated as the African Methodist Episcopal Church of the city of New York. When another church developed, with former Zion member William Miller preaching, the circuit was expanded to include both Zion and the new church called Asbury Church. Although controlled by their African membership, these churches remain under the jurisdiction of the Methodist Episcopal Church, led by a John Street elder. In other words, you got a separate church. As we go back to what we said, you can have your worship service, but you're still under the jurisdiction of an elder at John Street Church. In 1820, William Stillwell, the white elder responsible for Asbury and Zion churches, left due to the unfair financial arrangements between the dominant Methodist Church of New York, John Street, and other churches. This left Asbury and Zion without leadership. So Stillwell sees the inequity, the unfairness in this, and he said, I ain't gonna do this no more. Either we're gonna treat them equally or I'm not participating in it. So that didn't happen, so he just left the whole thing. Interested churches from New York, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, representing about 1,410 African American Methodists, met in 1821 in New York and formed a new conference under the jurisdiction of the Methodist Episcopal Church. This new conference received no assistance from the Methodist Episcopal Church. They create a new conference, but they're receiving no assistance. Now, you know what they mean by assistance, don't you? No apportionments, none of the offerings coming to them. William Stilwell and two other white ministers ordained James Varick, Abraham Thompson, and Levin Smith as elders in 1822. From the perspective of the Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodists had severed their relationship through the development of their own book of discipline. In the eyes of the Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodists had severed their relationship through development of their own book of discipline, the doctrine and discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America. So since you create your own discipline, you're on your own. We ain't gonna have nothing else to do with you. In 1824, the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church made it clear that it would not support African Methodists who formed their own book of discipline and ordained their own ministers. The various churches met and formed the African Methodist Episcopal Church in America, who some sources say it was added in New York. The addition of Zion occurred in around 1848 to distinguish this group from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had been formed earlier. Now, I'd always heard that there were these two churches, both had the same name, and now I see where that comes from. So the distinction, because one is started at St. George, and another one is started at St. George in Philadelphia, another one started at St. John, but they are beginning to develop and expand, and they create their own separate identity. One is African Methodist Episcopal Church, another is African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion. They have their own conference, elect their own bishops. The name of the denomination was explained as representing the historical heritage of members in Africa and connected to John Wesley's Methodism. They wanted to maintain, that's why, because they were referred to as Africans, because the word black has not, was not known, and they wanted to maintain that heritage, and they wanted to be connected to John Wesley. Think about that, because John Wesley is being specific in terms of where he feels Methodism should be going. But when it comes to America, somebody flips the script in terms of what Methodism is all about. Y'all getting mighty quiet up in here. Here are some early AME and AME Zion leaders. Some of these names may be familiar. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, who was the leader and one of the founders of the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass, who many people say looks like me. I don't look like him, he looks like me. And Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey in 1818, he helped found an independent AME congregation in Charleston, South Carolina. Today it is known as Mother Emanuel AME Church. He was a pastor and a community leader who was accused and convicted of planning a major slave revolt in 1822. Denmark Vesey. Why does the name Mother Emanuel AME Church, does that mean anything to y'all? Tell me what that means to you. Have you ever heard that name? Beg pardon? Haven't there been shootings around Dauphin way? Oh, a massacre. Oh, a massacre occurred at the church. And who was the person that perpetrated the massacre? What was his name? Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof. Now, another aspect of this story that is making the rounds is the reason why Dylan Roof chose Mother Emanuel and why it was so sacred. Denmark Vesey and others are alleged to and were hung at sentence because they planned a slave revolt. And it was believed in the 1820s that Mother Emanuel was the, keep in mind, we said earlier, the AME Church was what? A dangerous organization because it was focusing on what? Education and freedom. And many of their members became pastors, took that freedom to the extent that America got its freedom. So then, because of that, the Citadel, how many of y'all heard of the Citadel? The Citadel was built not too far from Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and its cannons were pointed at Mother Emanuel after Denmark Vesey was hung. Did y'all know that? So Dylan's Roos didn't just arbitrarily walk into Mother Emanuel Church, but it's the history. The cannons of the Citadel are pointed at this church. Oh, you man, it's downtown. In other words, never again shall you attempt what Denmark Vesey attempted. All right. Now, we've dealt with the Methodist Church, what it advanced, its themes. We dealt with the separation of AME Church, AME Zion. Now let's get back to the Methodist Episcopal Church and its position on slavery. And then we'll call it a day. The Methodist Episcopal Church and slavery. In his thoughts on slavery in 1774, John Wesley wrote, quote, "I strike at the root of this complicated villainy. I absolutely deny all slaveholding to be consistent with any degree of natural justice." And I'm kind of abbreviated here. Much less is it possible that any child of man should ever be born a slave. Liberty is the right of any human creature as soon as he or she breathes the vital air, and no human can deprive him or her of that right. This is a pamphlet, sermon, a document that Wesley wrote called Thoughts on Slavery. You can Google it. As my Sidney Dunklin would say, Google it, Reverend Outlaw, Google it. You can Google John Wesley's Thoughts on Slavery. This is just an excerpt of that. 1774. The Baltimore Conference was the first conference to raise the question about slavery, the Baltimore Conference. In 1780, the conference included question 17. Does this conference acknowledge that slavery is contrary to the law of God, man and nature, and hurtful to society? You know, there's these questions, the disciplinary questions that are raised. So this was question 17. The answer is yes. Slavery in the beginning of Methodism was a moral matter, as we saw early on. Francis Asbury was against it, others were against it. Slavery had an ill effect upon persons enslaved, as well as upon the slaveholder. I guess my spell check didn't catch that one that time, Trey, I'm sorry. In 1783, the Methodist Society took action regarding slaveholding by holding local preachers accountable. Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury opposed slavery in the beginning. Remember, we talked about that earlier on. In the beginning, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury opposed slavery in the beginning. Some of these men compromised their views later as slavery became more entrenched and more profitable. Did you get that? Some of these men, because women were not making decisions at this point. Some of these men compromised their views later as slavery became more entrenched and more profitable. The Christmas conference in 1784, the Methodist Church was prophetic on social issues in its first session. Question 42 was raised. What methods can we take to extirpate slavery? What methods can we take to extirpate slavery? Answer. We view it as contrary to the golden law of God, on which hang all the laws and the prophets and the inalienable rights of mankind. We therefore think that our bounden duty to take immediately some effectual method to extirpate this abomination from among us. 1784. This resolution was passed by the Christmas conference, but not unanimously. Many church members, local preachers, and even some of the itinerant preachers were opposed to this resolution. With the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, slavery became more entrenched. The great slave traders were from New England. The southern states began to develop a rationalization for slavery. Some argued slavery was part of the divine economy for Negroes, and they based this on scriptures in Genesis 9:22 and verses 25 through 27, Ephesians 6 through 5, and Colossians 3:22. In other words, it was the doctrine of providential design that God created Africans to be slaves and whites and Europeans to be masters. While slavery was becoming more institutionalized in the South, a new and a more aggressive anti-slavery movement was beginning in the North. By 1808, anything pertaining to slaveholding among members had been eliminated from the Book of Discipline. In 1784 it was in the Book of Discipline, but by 1808, anything pertaining to slaveholding among members had been eliminated from the Book of Discipline. Slavery ceased to be a connectional interest within the Methodist Episcopal Church. But keep in mind, the AME Church strengthened its position, its anti-slavery position. But in the Methodist Episcopal Church, slavery ceased to be a connectional interest. Okay, that'll do. Good. A phrase in disciplinary language was, "We declare that we are ever convinced of the great evil of slavery." It was put in the discipline of 1824 and remained in the discipline until 1860. In 1828, a resolution was presented to the General Conference providing that any slaveholder who treated his slaves inhumanely, either by refusing them proper care or separation by means of purpose and sale of members of the family, should be brought to trial as in the case of immorality. The motion was placed on the table and never removed. The General Conference of 1836 and 1840, the issue of slavery and slaveholding members intensified. At the General Conference of 1836 and 1840, the issue of slaveholding and slavery intensified. The bishops refused to place petitions dealing with slavery on the calendars of any annual conferences. Chew on that for a minute. The 1840 General Conference closed with no significant action on the slave question. The Southerners felt they had now buried the issue forever. Some felt it was a futile effort. A few withdrew from the church and formed the Wesleyan Methodist Church. That's where the Wesleyan Church comes from. How many of you heard of that? The memorable 1844 General Conference was convened at Green Street Church in New York City on May 1st, 1844. 33 annual conferences were present with 180 delegates. The Episcopal address was made with no mention of slavery. On May the 20th, 1844, the Andrew case became before the General Conference from the Committee on Episcopacy. Bishop James Andrews was a slave owner. He also had inherited slaves from his first and second marriages. I didn't know Bishop could have more than one wife, but that's interesting stuff here. But I'm going to stay out of that one. He had also inherited slaves from his first and second marriages, which Georgia law permitted him from freeing. Some of the delegates felt unity was more important than the emancipation of slaves. In other words, do we want unity or do we want to free the slaves? Others believed that the owning of slaves was contrary to the law of God. The issue could not be resolved. So on June 1st, 1844, Bishop James Andrews was suspended from the episcopacy of the Methodist Episcopal Church. After 60 years, the Methodist Episcopal Church divided into two denominations. The Methodist Episcopal Church South was located chiefly below the Mason-Dixon line, and the Methodist Episcopal Church North served the area above the Mason-Dixon line.